All right, all right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to the last session of the day. We are going to talk about hacking and defending APIs for fun and profit. Yes, indeed. So the attacking is more fun, defending is more profitable. We get to do both at WIB. It's fantastic. So in just a few minutes, I'm going to introduce Zach Bistra. He is here. He's our head of research and leads our offensive team. Not that they are offensive people, but the things they do are offensive in nature. So I try to be careful with that. And thank you for dealing with my accent. I sound very much like Brad Pitt in Inglourious Bastards. You know, when I try to speak French, it's terrible. Bonjour. You take the boy out of Texas, you can't take the Texas out of the boy. So my name's Chuck Hare, and I'm going to talk about hacking APIs and defending APIs, and we're going to cover some of the common blind spots. We're going to go through several real-world case studies of layering the basics of security. So the fundamentals haven't changed. The technology has changed, for sure. The technology continues to change. But the fundamentals, one of the things that we say here is that history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And so while my company is new, WIB has been around for about 15 months, I'm a bit of a gray beard. I am not new. I am not young. The company is young, but I am not. We've seen this same phenomenon years and years and years. The first time we rolled out desktop PCs, I was at a very, very large bank in the southeastern U.S. We did things with the PCs you would never do today. When we went to the cloud for the first time, we didn't know what we were doing. Adoption always outpaces security. And so because I'm from Texas, you know, I'll say things like APIs made it around the world before security got our boots on, right? So I'm a defender. I've been a 20-year CISO, almost 20 years, 18 years. And my colleague here, Zach, represents API defenders, or API attackers, excuse me. So we're going to go through some of the fundamentals and case studies, and I'm going to talk defender, I'm going to talk about threat modeling and all this stuff that I find interesting, and then Zach is going to come up and show you how to blow all that up and come in anyway, right? And so Zach will join us up here in just a second. But fundamentally, why is API security different, right? APIs themselves aren't really new. I think the first API was published somewhere in the late 70s at IBM, right? But the adoption of APIs and the transition from monolithic to microservice-based web applications has definitely been on a logarithmic scale of adoption over the last, maybe 10 years or so, maybe less. And when you change the architecture, you change the attack surface, right? So in another slide, I'm going to show you a sort of a graphical view of a monolithic versus microservice architecture. And so when your attack surface changes, the attackers change. The attackers want to do the same thing that every developer wants to do. Maximum benefit, least effort, right? Nobody's looking to make their job hard. And in fact, from a process design perspective, that's one of the things that we say at WIB over and over and over again is make the right way the easy way. If you can just harness the power of human laziness, people will always follow that process, right? The same thing goes for attackers and defenders. So when the attack surface changes, the attacks themselves change. And your defenses have to evolve to understand how the attackers are changing their attacks, right? Your defense should be informed by the offense. In 2011 in US banking, we were all worried about denial of service attacks, mostly because groups that were aligned and in the orbit of particular regime in the Middle East were attacking US banking interests. We were all worried about denial of service. We're not so worried about that now, right? If we weren't constantly monitoring how the attackers are changing, we'd still be fighting that last war, and we're trying not to do that. What that means, though, is your defenses have to continually evolve, and the traditional defenses like WAFs and API gateways were never designed to understand logic-based attacks. They were never designed to do that, right? So if you have a fish, that fish may be a perfectly good fish, but that fish does not know how to ride a bicycle. It was not designed for that. WAFs and API gateways were not designed to understand business logic, and they can't. Unfortunately, many of my colleagues, CISOs in not only finance, but also government critical infrastructure. I've got a lot of friends in the .gov and the .mil communities back in the States. They think they have this sort of false sense of equivalence. I have a WAF. It's a layer 7 device. APIs speak HTTP. I'm okay, right? Not so much. Not so much. So when you change the architecture from a monolithic to a microservice-based architecture, the way that I'm explaining this and trying to bring my colleagues along is, imagine that your security model, take it out of the technology realm or the computing realm. Imagine you're trying to guard a castle. You got a castle and a drawbridge and a moat and some guys standing out in front of it with a halberd or a spear. You got one way in, one way out. That's kind of a monolithic app. Just bear with me, don't get technical. But it's a fairly easy model, and from an upgradability perspective, it's not very easy to change. It's not very easy to remodel a castle, right? It's not very easy to incrementally, change the way that works. But from a security perspective, once you understand it, it's actually pretty straightforward. When you change that to a monolithic-based architecture, you change your castle and a moat to more like a strip mall, with external doors on all the stores and cash registers on all the stores and ways into the back offices of the mall on all the stores. And if your security guys have a spear standing out in front of the parking lot of the mall, they are missing a lot. And this is the kind of thing that we see a lot out in the wild. So to understand, in the security field, we do this thing called threat modeling. And to do threat modeling effectively, all you do is basically take your system documentation and you lay a risk lens over it. One reason we do that is to make sure developers are actually documenting things. The second is that you have a base common understanding with your dev teams about how applications work in the ecosystem, and you need to understand 4 things: assets, actors, interfaces, and actions. Right? It's no more complicated than that. And just remember, a reminder, the I in API stands for interface. Right? So these are just interfaces. And we need to know who's doing what to what via what. However, APIs broadly expand who's doing what to what via what. Some are used by, machine-to-machine calls. Some are used by a human that interacts with a website that then interacts with an API, or an API that calls another API, right? It's a very complex architecture. And Zach gave a presentation just a few minutes ago about the complexity being the enemy of security. It is. It makes it harder and harder to track and figure out who's doing what to what via what. And if you're depending on the same tools, like your WAFs and API gateways, these rule-based systems, they don't understand this complexity and they don't understand logic-based attacks, right? So fundamentally, this is the challenge that we're up against. And when adoption outpaces security, the results are unfortunately predictable. I haven't even added in the Twitter ones, right, that have been in the headlines, or some of the others just from the last couple of weeks, right? The Coinbase, probably my greatest hits of 2022, probably that one, where you could exchange any number of tokens of one cryptocurrency for the same number of tokens of any other cryptocurrency through their API. So if you've got 100 Shiba Inu or Dogecoin or whatever, and you wanted 100 Bitcoin, there you go. And once it's on the blockchain, that is done, right? These are the type of API vulnerabilities that are making it out in the world. And I'm not throwing shade at these guys. I've been a defender too long. They're but for the grace go I. This could have happened to any of us. But this is the attack surface that's out there. And so I'm going to dive into the use cases and case studies. And when you see these symbols here, one of the things that we do at WIB that we learned from a lot of experience in the space is you can't only put one view at this problem and really solve for it. So like monitoring on the right-hand side, you talk about shield right. Monitoring production traffic is a useful lens, but it is only that. It is a useful lens. It is not magic. Looking back in code, looking in your code bases, you can determine a lot about APIs, what APIs are exposed. Just finding all the APIs is hard, right? So you can find a lot of APIs back in code. You can do code analysis, but to really beat up an API, it's got to be interactive, and that's the testing part in the middle. And while you can automate a lot of attacks, we see a lot of bot attacks against APIs, in various industries, retail and things like that. While we can automate the attacks, the creativity that it takes to actually chain attacks against APIs and find flaws in business logic, like the examples we're going to walk you through, that still requires a human. If you've been playing around with ChatGPT as much as I have, you're interested in AI. It's cool. It's fun. It is not magic. It is not yet ready to replicate the intelligence of a creative person. And so at WIB, we offer a software platform and a penetration testing as a service, and they are meant to be self-reinforcing and complementary. I'm not here to talk product, but this is what we do. We monitor code, we monitor production traffic, and then we overlay that with real testing with people with years of experience in attacking APIs. So the first one, I'm just going to talk about blind spots. Security 101, you can't secure what you can't see, right? APIs present a huge blind spot. And what's particularly troubling to me as a defender and a lifelong CISO, and there's a reason why CISO stands for career is suddenly over. It's always a blind spot somewhere, right? It's never the stuff, and if you come from banking or healthcare or a heavily regulated industry, your security guys probably walk around with a risk register and they make you write down and sign business acceptance forms and things like that. I accept this risk. It's never the stuff on your risk register that winds up in a breach. It's always something you didn't know about. This particular company, this is one of the big logistics companies, and there's only a few, so I'm not going to say which one it was. This install was fully on premises. Like a lot of technology modernization projects, which means slapping an API in front of your AS400 that's been there since 1985, this is the kind of thing that a lot of companies are still dealing with. Modern finance still runs on mainframes. It's just, let's just be real, it does. So the theme here is visibility. So we installed a traffic monitor here. This is the magnifying glass lens here. And in the course of about an afternoon, we found 30 APIs and 400 endpoints that they didn't know they had. And then we found one of them that was in front of a customer database with no authentication required. Well, that's a problem. And then we found the endpoint that does SMS authentication, where you get your 4-digit PIN number. And because it was only a 4-digit PIN, there's only how many possibilities? 9,999. Then we saw 1,240-something requests from the same source against that endpoint right in a row. So we found 30 APIs you didn't know you had, 400 endpoints you didn't know you had. Here's exposed customer data. That's probably not good. And you're actively under attack. And the core message back to the security team here was, I'm glad that we know this now. So let's move past the proof of value stage and let's get to actually solving for this. But you were under attack yesterday too. You were under attack a week ago too. You just didn't know it. And so one of the challenges that we have in this emerging space, this API security space, is that this is evolving so rapidly. When we talk about, 50% of APIs are unmanaged, that assumes that you know the denominator, that you know how many are actually out there. And when I talk to CISOs, they say, I don't know, that's high. You guys are a vendor, you're exaggerating. And I talk to head of DevOps, and they're like, it's more like 90. More like we just don't know how prevalent this stuff is because customers aren't necessarily looking yet. But everywhere that we look, we find something. So this is just like phase 1, visibility. Understand what you have. Phase 2, this is a social organization in the US. It's down in the South. And here we have 2 main lenses that we looked at. One was traffic and one was code. And the theme here was context. So we started monitoring traffic, and we also started looking at code. And in the traffic and in the code, we found twice as many APIs as they expected. This is very common. How many APIs and endpoints do you have? Well, I would think we have about 50 APIs, and you've got 150 or something like that, right? And then we found, looking at the code, we found 5 APIs that were basically the same endpoint structure. Much of the logic was the same. All 5 were vulnerable to cross-site scripting, which, by the way, as of about the last 4 months, injection is now the #1 attack vector against APIs, displacing BOLA and broken function level authorization as the types of attacks that we see. BOLA and broken function level authorization are still dramatically more in 2022 than they were in 2021, but there's even more injection, so it's more badder, it's more worse for injection year over year than the other attack types. And what we found here was we found these 5 different versions, and then when we looked in traffic, so we saw the 5 versions in the code base, right? When we looked in traffic, we only saw traffic going to one of them. So there was no intentional backwards compatibility issue, or I haven't migrated customer X over yet. And so what we were able to tell that customer with this context that we put together from traffic and code is you can reduce your attack surface by 80% just by shutting off those services that you're not using. And instead of spamming your dev teams with 10 JIRA tickets to fix the cross-site scripting and BOLA issues that you have, just fix it once. And now we start monitoring and create a baseline of your traffic based on your new hardened attack surface, which is now 80% more secure than it was 2 weeks ago. This is the kind of thing that you get with context. It helps you to prioritize the work. And if you start spamming your internal teams with remediation and false positives, because what's the first thing the dev team is going to say if you send a remediation ticket to an old version of the API? We don't even use this. It's a false positive. You're wasting my time. And they're right. You are wasting their time. But the attack surface is still exposed. Just because you don't see it in the traffic doesn't mean that an attacker couldn't find it if they're enumerating from the outside. So this is the example of visibility plus context. This is another one here. This is actually a good example of shift left. This is purely a code-based exercise because this customer did what we love. They came to us and they wanted to secure their APIs before they go live to the outside. Now what that means from us in practical terms is we don't have traffic that we can use to create a baseline. Now, we can do some enumeration and things like that in, say, a QA environment. But if you're looking for normal traffic, a QA environment is not a great place to get normal traffic, right? Think of your QA tests. A man walks into a bar. He orders a beer. He orders 100 beers. He orders 1,000 beers. He orders negative 1,000,000 beers. He orders a zebra. That's not a very good baseline for what, normal traffic looks like. It'll tell you what's there, right? But it doesn't necessarily tell you how somebody's going to interact with it. But by looking in the code, we found 87 potential BOLA issues based on the way that they declared their variables. And then we applied testing to that and found out, no, actually, they had a manual peer review process that where they rationalized all these variable declarations. So this is a design issue, but you're not actually exposed to the outside world. So rather than spamming their teams with 85 different issues that they weren't actually vulnerable to, we were able to say, hey, by the way, you've got a poor coding practice. Change the way you do this in your development life cycle. And you're also, and we didn't list it here, but you're also misusing an auto mapping library. So stop doing that. And they can fix it at the well left of boom. Way shifting left before you actually find the vulnerabilities in business logic or whatever's vulnerable to the outside world, right? So this was really a traffic or a code-based and a testing-based scenario. Now this one though, once you get those things under control, now you can really start worrying about the advanced attacks like the one Zach's going to walk you through here, right? So now that the euro and the dollar are close to parity, this is about a $90 billion to $95 billion institution. And banks measure themselves by assets under their protection. That's not a U.S. bank, but it would be in the top 50 of U.S. banks by assets, which is how banks measure themselves. And so I'm going to hand the mic over, and Zach's going to walk you through how we hacked this bank for fun and profit. And this actually is an error message from their WAF, which then we punched through and did some fun stuff. So Zach, take it away.
Thank you so much. I mean, this bank wasn't they were very aware of security. They had a division of 20 pen testers actively trying to find vulnerabilities each day. So that is why we need to watch out for logic-based attack. So let's start. So we are starting from the end. What were the results of the scenario? So basically through a logic vulnerability, Weeb was able to produce money, how much money they wanted. We did it using executing a classic salami slicing attack. Now, if it's feel familiar, it's from Superman 3. So that was the inspiration for this kind of attack. So before I start, I noticed some weird behavior that were happening during during transactions. What happened was that the smallest amount that we were able to transfer were 1 penny. Now, I was asking myself, what will happen if I ask the API to transfer something that less than 1 penny? And we saw that there was a primitive of rounding up. Whenever the number were 0.00, let's say 51, it was rounding up to 1 penny. And where it was less, it was rounding out to 0. Now, there is no problem with it because it's taking 1 penny from my account and adding 1 penny to my wife's account. So no problem with that. And then I was thinking for about 1 day, I was like, something wrong here. Something doesn't work. And then we thought about a foreign exchange vertical. And then we thought something can go wrong. But before we could start to investigate that kind of vertical, we had to bypass a few obstacles. So the first obstacle that we had to bypass was the minimum amount. The UI had some sort of protection, and through the API we were able to bypass them. All those control features. We're going to see how we bypass them. The second one is fee. Every transaction you do in foreign exchange, somebody want money for it. So we had to bypass that. And the third thing was the max amount of daily transaction that we could have done. I mean, we need to do a lot of transactions. So here's a mock-up of how it looks like. And we can see, I don't know if you can see in the red, I try to put 1 penny, and it says to me basically, no. It has to be $3 or I think $5 if you want to do the transaction. And I was like, okay, let's try it on the API. And on the API, it was working. I was like, great, good for me. Now, the second thing was kind of tricky. I needed to bypass the fee. I mean, it wouldn't help me to do some sort of transaction if everything that I will earn will go through to the bank back through the fee. So I had to think about a way to bypass it, and I was like, okay, I could bypass one thing through the API, maybe something else is affecting through the API. And apparently one of the parameter which they were using had a directly effect on the fee. And when I send an empty string, there were no fee. So as you can see over here, those transactions were through the UI, and we can see that I had a commission for almost $7. And the next one over the top, we did through the API. So there weren't any commission. I was hitting the F5 a lot. I was like, maybe they forgot. Maybe it's going to come in a few minutes from now. It's just like hitting. And after 1 hour, I was like, okay, there's no fee. And there weren't even after a few days. So the last thing. So it's a little bit complicated. So bear through this with me. So we can see that's the actual attack that we're occurring. So we can see downstairs, we can see that 0.01 GBP. Okay, so I will start from the beginning. So the exchange rate for £1 is 1.55 Canadian dollars. And I was thinking, let's put the server on a problem. Let's create a problem and see how the server handles it. So what will happen if we only transfer 1 penny? So we can see that the server is supposed to multiply it. So we get 0.0155. Now the server has a problem. I cannot handle the things that I have to the left. I can only handle 2 decimal point after the 2 points after the decimal points. So I knew that the programmer from before, he decided to run it up, and I was crossing my finger. Let's see the same behavior. And we had it. And we can see that the server was running up. So what basically happened is we bought Canadian dollars from the bank for 1.155, and we sold it for 2. So each transaction, we almost made a half a penny. And when you can multiply that kind of behavior, just like by millions and millions of times through the API, you're making millions. So that's why it's a salami slicing attack, the way you have a salami, and each time you take a small piece until you take the whole salami away. So that's actually, when I did it at the beginning with US dollar and Canadian dollars, so I lost money. So we needed to write a small script that's going to help me find the right currency exchange. So we hit with the pound and the Canadian dollars. So that was fun, losing money at the beginning. So we have here the script, and we can see, and I'm going to ask you some questions. So first of all, we can see how this hack had a few phases, and we can see how things were connected together. And the last thing that I'm going to ask you is, what is the hack here exactly? All the responses got 200 okay. The bank had traditional defending systems. None of them were alerting. I mean, yeah, that sounds bring me a lot of money. Thank you. In that point, I was like to the CDO, I'm getting your next round. Don't worry about it. So none of the traditional things were alerting. Since it wasn't a very, very high amount of transaction, none of the regular things, none of the analysts saw it. So we basically were under the radar. Nobody knew. And I'm going to try to get outside of it. Okay, so that's me basically printing money. And was really, really happy. We had a big moral question in the company, but we chose the right right answer at the end. Yeah. 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 During the last year, yeah, it was hard. So now I'm gonna move the mic back to Chuck. Thank you so much.
So now, a little bit of what we in the States call inside baseball. I was the CISO for the bank that was named, not this bank, but the bank that was named most trusted bank in America, right? And I ran fraud. And when we're walking through this case study, I'm like, who would see this? Right? And if you think about it, what the normal monitoring that you have at your bank is monitoring accounts, right? Money movement in accounts. But the attack surface for this actually changes based on fluctuations in global currency rates. Your security folks aren't looking for that, right? So we went and talked to this bank and we said, hey, did you see us? And of course they didn't, but we wanted to ask. And we said, okay, well, this is what we did. You know, Zach walked them through the whole thing. And when would you have seen us? And they said, okay, give us a couple days. Got back together a couple days later, and they said, okay, here's what we came up with. And Zach, keep me honest, just to make sure I don't skip anything important. But essentially, when we empty the account, any account that we use for currency conversions, we've got to go back to the open market and buy more of that currency like anybody else does. And we do a look-back analysis to understand, did we get the fee income we expected? How much of this currency did we turn over? How often do we need to rebuy? They don't want to go buy on the market and pay commission, you know, every day. So they want to have a buffer of this that they have, right? And in this case, this was neither a British bank or a Canadian bank. So they didn't keep a lot of money in these accounts. That manual look-back process would have triggered at about $10 million in losses. And that's on a relatively small currency pair. So if you think of the banks, the big money center banks that are doing $6 trillion a month in FX conversions from the US dollar to the yen, how long could you run something like this under the radar without knowing it? Or my question to my banking colleagues in the US is, how do you know this isn't happening now? That's the problem, right? This whole API economy is creating a lot of blind spots. To Zach's point, they had an entire internal penetration testing team on staff that didn't see this. Change management processes didn't understand it. And Zach mentioned Superman 3. That came out in 1983. We in banking have known about salami slicing attacks for that's 40 years. A more modern, you know, is Office Space. Same thing, 1999. That was almost 25 years ago. It's not like we created some novel way to rip off money. Banking has known about these types of attacks literally for decades. What changed is the attack surface. What changed is the architecture and the attack surface, and we're making the old stuff new again, right? And we're evading detection. So in all these case studies, this one and the others, APIs and their vulnerabilities were the blind spots. Now, the next thing, though, every good update, in my view, should have three things. What, so what, now what? If the credits roll at the end of that, then everybody just leaves and we're all depressed because our banks are going to get ripped off. No. Going with the theme of your defense needs to be informed by the offense, this is the basis of what we do. This is how you can actually find these things. If you know how these attacks work and you know where to look, you actually can prevent and detect these types of attacks. And so this is just a mock-up of our dashboard. which you're happy to stop by the booth and see later on if you like. But this is the shift left and shield right, right? So the bottom left is your code, top right is production traffic. And if you're looking here at the bottom at your code, you should notice that you're relying on front-end systems and user-supplied input for control functions. We all know that's a no-no. You can never trust user-supplied input, right? We all know that. And rate limiting. Zach mentioned rate limiting. They had a lot of commercial customers that did hundreds of transactions a day, and every transaction is supposed to charge a fee. You know what banks love? Banks love them some fee income. So the more fees, the merrier, right? But if they had put rate limiting as a design of the API, or even in their API gateway, say $5,000 a day, you lost $50. You're a $90 billion bank. You can lose $50, right? You'll be okay. So you can see these type of design issues and types of vulnerabilities that may be available down here in the code if you're looking. Over here, up here in the middle, prevention and testing, this is where we actually found this. So during testing, if we had the opportunity to test these things before they went live via some combination of automated testing, automated enumeration, manual penetration testing when appropriate, you can find these things before they're exposed to the outside world rather than finding it after or somebody else finding it. Over here on the detection side, if you're monitoring production traffic and you understand what normal traffic looks like and how entities normally interact with your APIs, you can alert on deviations from that normative base. Even if you don't know what the issue is yet, you know it's different. This is why you get fraud alerts on your credit card, or you have to enter your zip code when you go to a new gas station, or go to a different country. Like, it's not normal. If you know what that looks like, our requests to the APIs didn't look like the normal API requests that they're used to getting from the browser, from the mobile app. If they had a baseline, they could have alerted on that. And down here in response, we used the same token and did it like a couple 100 million times. That's not a normal use case either, right? So you can do things like throttling, rate limiting, just blocking, throw up a CAPTCHA. There's all kinds of things that you can do if you know to expect that type of thing there. And by the way, one thing that we kind of glossed over during the demo, if you sell this currency off a penny at a time, eventually you're going to run out of money to sell. But because we made conversions free, convert it back and sell it again. And convert it back and sell it again. So we started with 10,000, with 20,000, converted it back. Converted it, got to 40,000, converted it back. It's kind of like going to a junkyard and stealing metal and then taking it back to the front desk and having them buy their own metal from you and just keep doing that. And then it's the nature of logarithmic, 20,000, 40,000, 80,000, 160,000, so forth and so on. Just keep doing that ad infinitum. You should have noticed that hundreds and thousands of requests were coming from the same source, and that's not normal behavior as well. So these problems are solvable if you're thinking like an attacker and putting the instrumentation in place in order to do it. How are we on time? What does our time look like?
You have 15 minutes left.
15 minutes. Okay, cool. I'm going to hit on a couple other cases because there are particular industries and verticals that I wanted to touch on. Although that is definitely my favorite case study right now. And the favorite case study right now, as Zach asked, what's the hack here? The light bulb that we're asking, like we did this at Black Hat and other security conferences, we're not ransoming your files back to you. We're not cracking your passwords. We're not decomposing your mobile app in MobSF and using your API keys that are probably in there. These were all legitimate requests attacking business logic. And that's what makes API security so hard. Not just the injection stuff, not just the attack surface that you're exposing that's never been exposed before, but the detection mechanisms that don't pick up business logic attacks. In this one, this is kind of an old school, a lot of issues that we have here, right? So APIs expose a lot of internal server version information, which allow us to very easily enumerate, missing CVEs, missing patches, all kinds of things on back-end systems. And in this bottom one, we had a public API that was exposed that allowed us to send email to their users through the customer support mailbox. Not set up a fake domain and spoof it. We literally could send email from that mailbox. You talk about an avenue for ransomware. Literally from their internal messaging system. In this one, we had multiple exposed libraries with vulnerabilities going back to 2007, including Log4Shell, Log4j. If I remember correctly, this one followed another penetration testing team by about 3 weeks. and they were not very happy with that other penetration tester. But I understand. Like the problem with penetration testing is, and we'll talk a little bit about this if we have time. Your pen testers don't necessarily enumerate APIs. They don't know that they're there. If you don't tell them to test the APIs, they don't. They don't necessarily know they're in scope. PCI DSS tomorrow, in my talk tomorrow, I'm going to talk about the compliance changes and a lot of the compliance changes and how they're changing. PCI, by the way, if you're in scope for PCI, as of the version 4.0 standard, they now specifically require API and business logic abuse testing, not only from a development perspective, but also from a controls and a penetration testing perspective. Now, the reason they do that isn't because they were bored and they needed new things to test against. The reason they do that is attackers are attacking this attack surface now, and that's the lever that they're using to try to make companies. I'll go into more detail on that in my talk tomorrow if you're able to join us. This one here, this was the biggest security operations provider in their home country, and we did POVs on the COVID-19 app. We found a lot of multiple exploitable vulnerabilities via their public mobile API. We don't do mobile app testing specifically, but we have a partner that does. That'll deconstruct your total mobile SBOM, tell you all the APIs that they're interacting with, and we can combine that lens with what we see and give you a great view if you're a heavily mobile front company. This one in here I wanted to mention specifically, being here in the EU. This was an online marketplace, and one of the things they did was travel, which means upload your passport photos. Upload your information right through the mobile app. We found a database with no authentication that exposed over 100,000 GDPR covered records via this API. That's a bad.
We actually created a Mongo database of all those files. We actually created a Mongo database, presented it to the customer, and gave it to him with all his files, and just asking him, now you can search them. It's going to be more convenient now.
Yeah. By the way, if you come by the booth, we'll talk about API penetration testing as a service. As a 20-year CISO, if you have external counsel that you would like for us to work through so that any results are protected under attorney-client privilege, it's not a bad idea. Because what we don't want to do is, hey, by the way, we found 100,000 records. Here this is via email, right? That kind of boxes the customer in. So there are ways that we can work with your counsel to keep the results of what we find secret. This next one's interesting. They had a field that was being intermittently sent as null that was causing a performance problem. It's not even really a security issue, but the visibility that the platform provided actually helped them troubleshoot this issue that they hadn't been able to figure out for a long time. So I thought I'd throw that one in. That was interesting. That was just visibility that they had missed. And then down here, this last one, I'm going to skip the third. This last one here, this is something that we see a fair amount. There's a tendency for devs to just pull all the data that they can and then drop what they don't need, which results in moving a lot more data and exposing that data to risk than they intend to. And in this case, this particular mobile app was getting a lot of data that the owner of the company never asked for, never wanted. And it was exposing them to liability that they never wanted to have. They didn't know that for a long time until we showed them the data they were actually getting. Oh, where the heck is all this coming from? He didn't say heck. But where is all this coming from, right? So that's another good point about the visibility and understanding what's actually coming through. So wrapping it up, if you need a hand, we can help. We just launched our API penetration testing as a service at the end of November. There are a couple of ways that we do that. We do one-time engagements. What I really like doing is entering into a 2-year or 3-year term. If you're a PCI covered entity and you need annual pen tests, or if you're a service provider and need semi-annual pen tests, it's actually incrementally less work for us to do those subsequent tests once we have an understanding of your environment. I'd be happy to talk to you guys about that. But this is not a commercial talk. We can talk more about that in the booth. So what kind of questions do you guys have for me or for our hacker in residence here? Yes, sir.
So when doing some kind of hacking or experimenting, did you ever found out about problems in the cloud that is not related to the client, but the cloud provider itself? And how often that happens?
So we are trying not to get inside the cloud because there are a lot of companies like Wiz and Orca that is there. But we can say that we are going to now release CV in another platform, which is a third-party platform, and we are definitely able to find those in clients. So I hope that's answered your question.
So I was on a panel recently on a podcast, and the CTO for GigaOM, so a guy named Howard Holton. I really like Howard. He's a great guy. He asked the panel, I thought, an interesting question. How many APIs does your storage platform expose? How many of those are documented? How many of those are you monitoring? Those are three very different questions. And something that I run into a lot because we're very much in a market education phase. The fact that you are here at API World means you are on the early adopter curve in a lot of ways, right? We're very much in a market education phase, and I talk to a lot of bank CISOs and others that say things like, I'm more worried about ransomware than API security. And then you think back to Howard's question, you're like, well, if you're worried about ransomware, but you're not monitoring the interfaces into your storage platform, which are not only about data movement, but also invocation of function. Don't confuse what an attacker chooses to do with the access that they have with how they got the access. One thing that we know about ransomware in particular, actually talking to the FBI and InfraGard in the US, is that while email is still the most common entry point for detected ransomware attacks, it's actually gone down about 50% year over year as attackers are pivoting to APIs and exposed services like RDP because everybody more or less has their shields up around email now, right? And so the attackers are going to flow to the path of least resistance. I predict we're going to see more and more of that heading in 2023 and 2024.